Hi everybody and welcome to the next ADAS lecture in our 2021 series with Simon Henley of Henley Halebrown. The Sterling Shop Prize nominated firm are based in central London and work on a variety of projects, mainly in London. Each building they make is carefully planned to reflect its social logic. After we hear from Simon tonight, we can open up for some questions, as we've said before, so just type these into the chat or the Q&A function where we can see them. And as I said, if you'd like to ask the questions and open up for a bit of a conversation, then just say so and we'll be able to unmute you. So before I pass on, I'll say a little bit about ADAS. We are a student-led society which aims to produce a range of lectures, workshops and social events to students and the wider architecture community. Although we can't be together in person this year, this hasn't stopped us, and we've already started putting on, we've already had people join us from all over the UK to speak or listen to our lectures. So tonight I'm excited to get on with our programme with another excellent speaker. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Simon.
Ken, thanks. Evening. So I'm going to talk, as you've asked, to talk about building with brick. And I'm going to talk about some of our preoccupations and then talk about 4 projects. 3 probably more concisely, and then 1 at some length to give you an illustration of the kind of process we go through to make a building. So our preoccupations, I think it's fair to say we're interested in mass, gravity, weight. Equally, we're interested in the way that buildings shape space and shape social interaction. That sounds a little scientific. Just people and their communal gatherings and life. And this building by Villanova Artigas in Sao Paulo, I think is a good illustration of those 2 things. One of the things which has kind of preoccupied us over the years is what I would describe as a sort of concentric plan, by which I don't mean a circular plan, but buildings that are planned around a kind of primary space, either inside or outside. What's also interesting about this building is its sort of substantial, physical, rudimentary qualities. But also we were there with our students 2 years ago after Bolsonaro won the election the very day. And it's a curious building because it doesn't actually have a front door. So it's possible to protest in the space. And it was built during the dictatorship that ran through the sort of 60s and 70s, or possibly into the 80s. Just a very interesting example of a socially motivated building where the physical properties, the material properties and the spatial properties seem to be kind of in sync. Just as much as we're interested in the sort of the heart of a building, we're also interested in the edge of a building. The threshold between inside and outside. And this has become increasingly concerning to us. This modest space outside some apartments in Cuba, or some flats, social housing, a kind of new modernist village. And, I don't really need to say much, but just to see how richly inhabited it is with the cot and the dog and the birds and the plants and the open shutters and that kind of, and because there are, in this case, you can see 2 flats, or you can see a flat to the left and a flat to the right, and there are 2 upstairs, so 4 families sharing that staircase, sharing that space, and it's an incredibly rich space, I think. And so the edges of buildings has been something which we have thought much about, and this is an etching of a theatre which we created out of a market stall, where we came up with an idea here and in this project, the idea of the brim, like the brim of a hat, that there's a sort of intensification of the social kind of social potential, I suppose, of a building at the kind of human scale, and how somehow that's different from the rest of the facade, much like the face below the brim of a hat, and the kind of the iconography of the hat, but then the features of the face being communicative. And so, and this kind of and I called the talk "Building with Brick and Studies in Liminal Space," because those two things seem to be so closely linked, certainly in our work, and perhaps it's partly by accident that certainly our earlier projects were adaptations of buildings, and so we found ourselves focusing on the facade. Not just the facade, but the space outside the facade, and how in this case we replaced the windows with doors and created galleries of external space, and how, of course, the interior becomes, sort of attentive to the outside, to the natural world, almost sort of medieval in this sense, like a multi-story cloister. And so whilst I suppose that there are a number of early projects where we intuitively found ourselves reacting to existing buildings, reacting to existing conditions, facades, and exploiting the threshold between inside and out. It's become more recently, by which I suppose mean in the last 10 years, we've sort of become very aware of the way that we build buildings radically different from any other generation. So this is an arts and crafts house, and this is Corbusier's Joule, Maison Joule. And these are very different sort of languages of architecture, but they're both masonry construction, where in a way the building that you see has the physical properties of how it's built. And I suppose as the 20th century went on, you get to a point where Buckminster Fuller makes this proposition over New York, where the threshold between inside and outside is nothing more than a sort of layer of film. It becomes a kind of performative, singular envelope between inside and out. And actually, the technology of building buildings now, although they often have the physical, let's say, the use of brick, the way that we used brickwork to build walls, which were the appearance of the building was the structural, was defined largely by the structural necessity. Whereas now, when we build brick buildings, that's rarely the case. And so, when we were invited to make some student housing for the University of Roehampton, that became, well, certainly part of the discussion, which has then led to further projects where we've been exploring this question of how to build, and particularly how to make facades of buildings which are more sort of intentional as opposed to cosmetic. And so this is sorry, I'm being interrupted. This is the Alton. This is Roehampton Vale, and this is parkland from originally from the 18th century. In the 18th century, they built a bridge over the Thames in this part of London, and that then invited a whole group of wealthy families to build villas, houses by people like Archer, Chambers, buildings with an extension by Soane, all sorts of buildings where you had this sort of formal house, garden, landscape opening onto parkland. And then in the mid 20th century, this area of Roehampton became the subject of one of the most world-renowned social housing schemes, the Alton West Estate, designed by the LCC in those days, and then subsequently the GLC, by Howell, Gillick, Partridge, and Amis when they were then employees there. And what's interesting, I suppose, is that this parkland landscape and these villas were kind of co-opted into this utopian social world. And they went as far as to integrate artworks. And our site is the area marked in red. At the head of this vale, you can see as it were, if you're facing south from our site, so from right to left, you have the point blocks on your left and the slab blocks on the right. And in the 1950s, this house was still essentially in its own garden, with an open prospect of that landscape before the LCC built the estate. And you get a sense here from this plan, the house, and in red dotted is a house that was demolished in the early 20th century. And the owners, I guess, of the house that survived extended their, I don't know if you can, Glenn, can you tell me, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So this had been 2 gardens and 2 houses. And in the early 20th century, this family acquired this garden and this house, demolished the house, although extraordinary, it had wings by Soane, and built a sunken garden with a summer house. And this is how it was, and this is how we found it. And I guess the question we were posed by the university, it's a site for which there was absolutely no, in a way, precedent or argument for building on, because the house is Grade 2 star listed, the housing is Grade 2 star listed, and so we had to build an argument with Historic England, the 20th Century Society, and every sort of conservation group you can imagine. And we started, I suppose, with the idea that perhaps that sunken garden could become a courtyard. And that then led to this idea that we could place a building either side of the courtyard, or rather the sunken garden, and then we might make a new building at the other end of the surviving house, which would be like a residual wing from, there had been a wing on this side of the house, not approximately here. So it was kind of an argument that we were able to construct, to call it a master plan is not quite right, but to conceive of a plan where the latent structure of the landscape would provide the sort of the geometrical and spatial underpinnings for this for these new buildings. So you can see there's a building on the right and a building on the left of the courtyard, now framing this space in the summer house. And although there's a rotation in the axis, you'll notice that the third building is actually on axis across the front of the terrace with its own entrance here. So the idea that each of these buildings was intimately connected with the other, these two self-evidently, this less evidently, but actually axially, absolutely. And partly there was, there had been discussions about developing other parts of the site, but that was, the important thing was to keep the vista from the house to, I want to say it's the south, which I think it is, down the garden and so on. So you can see then in its wider context how these 3 new buildings form a structure and how they then relate to the slab blocks to the north and to the point blocks to the south and the open space in between. And then in this series of drawings, we start to build up a 3-dimensional kind of explanation. There's the first of the buildings forming the east side to the courtyard and the summer house, the west building, the shape of which conceived to, as it were, a vice probably seems a bit aggressive, but to capture that space so these 2 points align, although the geometry is very different. And I'll explain perhaps the geometry of this in a moment. And then you have a building here which, although it extends to frame that space, it actually steps back because of a huge belt of trees here, an old field boundary. By the same token, this building on the street has a relationship with the original house, Downshire House. And then you see how the third building with its central point of entrance also forms part of this ensemble. And so here you can see the building on the left, the west building, and the building on the right, just a glimpse of it and how it captures that space. And I'll talk more about the construction in a minute, but it's really just to look at the sort of typologies. And I suppose the typologies are drawn from, well, we were drawing from the typologies of what was there. On the one hand, the kind of villa large domestic villa architecture of the 18th century house, as it were, country house, as these would have been at the time. These would have been open landscapes, and the modernist, I suppose, if you go back to this diagram, sort of pinwheel plan of this building. So broadly speaking, two typologies belonging to the 18th century, and one typology belonging to the 20th century, although made in the 21st century. And here you can see we turn now looking south with Downshire House in the mid distance, and the third building, the south. So various changes in scale and subtle changes in geometry. And part of the reason why this building is stepped like this is because of the plan of the retaining wall from the early 20th century, which forms part of the curtilage Grade 2 star listing of the house. And then, so here we can see the plan and that recess of the middle 4 bays, which is 4 houses for 12 students, and then these two projecting forwards reflects that step in the plan in the wall. And we introduced a staircase here either side to make a more direct connection. The rest of the wall is original early 20th century. One of the interesting things that results from the building having these wings is that the two sides, the north side is just 2 stories and the south side is 3 stories and the middle section is 4 stories. But what this does is it pushes the primary part of the building, 4-story building, back, and you lose the 2 wings in amongst the woods. And it has this curious relationship of scale of these 2 sides, which seems odd as a kind of, I suppose, in terms of the presumption that somehow this was going to be a symmetrical building, but it takes on a kind of picturesque quality when seen in perspective in relation to Downshire House, both in terms of the receding volumes, but also in terms of the perspective, the geometry rather. So this is giving you a sense of relationship between that and the wall and the new staircases. And then the second building, you'll start to notice these heavy V shapes in plan, which I'll come back to in a minute. But you can see here that the primary shared spaces are at the ends of the kind of pinwheel, and otherwise the rooms are facing east and south, and even the rooms on the north side are facing northwest. And this is an elevation looking west, and again I'll talk more about the sort of language of construction in a minute. But this is really just to give you a sense of how the building sits in the landscape. And I mentioned William Chambers, and William Chambers had been responsible for one of the houses, but he'd also been responsible for the pagoda in Kew. And we were drawing on, I suppose, geometrical ideas of the octagon and the octagon here in the pagoda, and here in a staircase, a wooden staircase within Manresa House, which is listed, Grade 1 listed, another house in Roehampton, this one by William Chambers as well. The staircase has long since gone, but the memory of that staircase felt like something that would be able to be used to generate the sort of pattern of the buildings. In the case of the south building, it becomes the kind of reasoning behind an octagonal staircase and these half hexagonal bay windows to the kitchens that frame the entrance and some other bays. And then it starts to become, in this kind of Christmas cracker plan, the negative spaces of the balconies here to east and west, and here the staircase. And then in elevation, in terms of the entrance and the bay windows either side. But also in the detailing of some of the precast concrete structural elements around the building, but rarely and therefore special moments, but this idea repeating in the building. And then it came to the question of how to, I suppose, to construct these. And we were looking at the 18th century load-bearing buildings and the 20th century frames. And the question was, how might we combine these? And this model illustrates this idea. And it was predicated perhaps on one thing that the university was keen to try, or was happy after much discussion, to make bedrooms with French windows, which allowed us to, as it were, translate a wall into something more structural. And so what you see here is essentially beams or planks with brick piers, arrowhead piers, bearing on these elements and forming a load-bearing structure. And in a way, this becomes, it becomes an independent structure, quite literally supported on the same foundations as the sort of inner building. So you have a fairly conventional structure in situ concrete, made watertight, as it were. And then we built, in effect, ruins around the more conventional building, load-bearing ruins. And so the facade is not in a way it's not a matter of composition as something which is purely visual. It is deliberate, structural, and spatial, and in a way, is the thing that characterizes the experience. It becomes a third space between the interior and the landscape. It becomes a threshold through which all the students have, let's say, common experience, even if not communal experience. And then, of course, it then translates into the kind of architectural character of the building, and explores an idea where we can return to the idea of load-bearing construction and an architectural facade, or a facade which is in no way accidental. So now I'm going to move on to the next two, which are two housing schemes in East London, in Hackney. The left-hand building is Frampton, and the one on the right is Littleton House. They're both commissioned by London Borough Hackney as mixed tenure housing. And they've just been finished. So I've got some drawings and model photographs and a few photographs of the completed buildings, but we don't have many completed photographs. So this is a fairly brief explanation. But two sites here. This is a 20th century housing estate. And although that site here extends as a space, the actual space in which to construct the building was here on the road. And the project really is about reconciling a 20th century sort of urbanism of housing estates, which is sort of autonomous and self-referential, with a 18th, 19th century city grain, which is more to do with paths that lead to places and buildings that frame those thoroughfares. So you can see, although there's not much left of it, there is some historic fabric on the right-hand side, but there's certainly historic building lines, whereas on the left-hand side, there's a sort of loose relationship between the estate and the street. And this is the space between, with the plot to the south, and the new building here and the other new building here. And they take on sort of typological roles that perhaps we describe this as three villas, and here we might describe this as a palazzo. And so these three villas are occupying a space loosely at the end of this terrace, and one closing that space. And as a sequence of forms, they're framing the street and loosely opening up the the space. Bear in mind this is north, and so wanting to get south light and also a route for pedestrians in here. They're a mixture of two-story flats or houses and lateral flats, and the thing I suppose that distinguishes them is that the way we're trying to explore is what the two primary ways of building a building as solids, as masonry solids, brick solids, and as frames. And so perhaps conventional ideas about how you might circulate to find your flat, and how you might use the phrase that people use, amenity space, balconies, terraces, things like that, which may often normally be read as sort of functional things, here take on this there's a duality between the warm space, warm cellular internal spaces that will meet the brief for making a home. On the one hand, faced and made as monolithic forms in brickwork with relatively little detail, contrasted with these demonstrative or demonstrable frames of cold construction in precast concrete, which are establishing a kind of equally important space outside between, as it were, the rest of the world and the interior, the domestic interior. This is the street elevation, which takes on, in a way, a quite, we wanted the street elevation to be, in a way, more formal, more recognizably like the front facades of houses, whereas, therefore, then the frames, as you see in this plan, face west, north, and south, and east, and relate to pieces of landscape. and you see here that there's although the colours change, there's a material difference between these framed elements and these primary forms. And so then one's exploring the idea of how these frames are also integral into the construction, and you'll see how we have in situ concrete frames inside and precast elements outside, and how these are actually, they form. So what we're trying to avoid, I suppose, technically we're trying to avoid lots of bits of steel, shelf angles and elements to support the brickwork. And so the precast becomes, in a way, the support for the wall. So we build the brickwork off the precast, and we're using the precast elements, columns and slabs, decks, as part of the structure, as you can see here, and as you can see here, completed. So it's a language of very, very simple distribution of more or less square, sometimes flush, sometimes deeply recessed windows, very, very plain, no expressed sills, minimal kind of detailing of the parapet, and then very definite kind of expression of these precast elements. And this is the facade to the courtyard, to the rear. And these two buildings share a core, which is why there is no staircase or lift in this building, hence the bridges to the flats on this side. And one of the insides on the flats. And then looking at the other building, so the Palazzo, where we suppose we take a slightly more confusing or meshed relationship between the monolithic masonry building and the frames. And here the frames are fulfilling a slightly different role, helping to scale the building in its context, which you'll see in the final photograph. Typologically, this is it's planned with 6 flats. Well, so I suppose this plan just shows how we're using literally the whole site, and it has layers of space, as it were, converging, planned around that central hall. And the building is 5 stories, and a 5-story hall felt to us to be in an inappropriate scale. So it's a building with 4 dual aspect flats in the corners, 2 single aspect flats on the sides, served by a lift and a staircase, the geometry of which approximates to the outer geometry. And you'll see the deck here and these sort of ears here and one over the entrance here. And then a kind of, okay, in a sense, what happens is that the precast is kind of pressed through the facade of the building, further out into the world, where it's doing a job of kind of layering and creating that threshold. So this is the busiest street to the right and to the east and to the south, and less so on these sides. Then when you get to the top of the building, this space in the middle becomes an external courtyard, and around it, rather than 6 flats, are 8 houses over 2 stories. And the frame is being used here partly to scale the building as well as to serve as that sort of threshold space. And here you can see in the middle of the courtyard. And that's the hall now complete and photographed. And that's the courtyard, which we don't yet have a photograph of. And this kind of, what one starts to be talking about is the sort of almost like a typological reading of these threshold spaces in terms of the geometry of the plan and the geometry of the columns. So, for example, in the previous, in the Frampton building, the other of this sort of pair of buildings, we're using orthogonal geometries to form the structural elements, the buildings. Whereas here we have a triangular column, which then forms this kind of outer layer. And you'll see in the model that sort of relationship between the two, and how here we have this frame clearly superimposed, and here it starts to kind of almost cleave or slide into the facades, and here as built. And you can see the way in which this has a scalar relationship with the things around it. And here you can see as you turn the corner how that the precast here is, as it were, emerging out of the masonry and being used here in much the same way that one might use a shelf angle of steel, but this is a shock-connected piece of precast off of which we can build this brickwork, in the same way that this frame is both, it's creating a usable space, but it's also, and therefore, a social, I suppose, device between the public street, pavement, and the apartment. But it's also a constructional device by which the front line of columns are, along with the deck, helping to support the brickwork floor by floor, because the deck is then shock connected back to the slab. So these things are integral to the structure inside the building, the warm concrete frame construction, and therefore there is very little. I mean, there are increasingly sustainable reasons for doing what we're doing, but it's the sort of discipline that comes from using the sort of primary elements of the building to support the skin of the building, which would otherwise be reliant on, I suppose we use the word tectonic, and we will abuse the word tectonic, but there's a sort of meaningful relationship between these structural elements and these walls. Now I'm going to switch slideshows at this point, if I can manage it. And just, sorry, bear with me. Here we go. Right, hopefully this will work. So, Glenn, can you see that?
Yeah, you're not on full screen though. Oh, there we go. We're in. Sorry.
Right. Okay. So this is the last project, and there's quite a few slides, but I should go at a reasonable pace. But I wanted to talk actually about the process that we go through when we make a building. And this is a building. This is what people have come to call a kind of hybrid building. It's a school and an apartment building, and you're looking at the facade of the apartment building here. And it in a way, it follows this this body of thinking about the physical properties of building. Go back to the title, Building in Brick. This question of how can you build in brick when we, in a way, don't build in, we do not build in load-bearing brickwork. Well, rarely. As we managed to do at the University of Hampton with Chadwick, we were at the limits of what was possible in terms of load-bearing construction. So you can see how we're exploring other ways of making sense of the question of the interrelationship between the masonry facades that we see and the structural systems that we are obliged to use. At the same time as thinking of the social potential, as it were, of a school, literally as social infrastructure, as the New York American sociologist Eric Klinenberg talks about the idea of social infrastructure and the role of schools and libraries in that. So in fact, we've built two schools here. One, I think you can probably see the cursor. There's a secondary school here, which we were built first, and then the primary school with an apartment building. This is a Regent's Canal, and this is the Kingston Canal Basin. And for those who know London, this is one of sort of historic Roman roads that runs north out of the city. It's called Kingston Road, and our site is in a very interesting place. This is an area that was developed in the early 18th century, not as intended, but you can see there is a legacy of some diagonal streets, and one of them, Enfield Road here, means that although our site is a kind of corner site, it's almost open on three sides, as you'll see. And this is the secondary school, and this is the primary school as its profiles or as completed. So I just thought very quickly talk about the secondary school, which was built in a very different way, many respects. This is an old telephone exchange. This is old wharf master's house. This is the canal basin here. And so renovated these two buildings and built these new buildings to create a kind of ensemble around a kind of precinct or precincts, as these models show, almost like a still life. And then as this drawing shows that there's this kind of, it turns out that these share an escape strategy, and hence we integrate into the relationship between old and new, a series of bridges. And then the buildings themselves are steel frame. And so the brick is quite literally a cladding. Very economic building, very simple use of brickwork, but what we're exploring here was the formal complexities which were possible and to a certain extent necessary to deal with listed buildings, views and impact, and simple devices like the buttress, which makes an otherwise non-structural brick skin. It gives some recognizable structural properties to the brickwork. And it contrasts with the other building, which is a much more simple form, but a curiously disposed set of windows, which are sort of emblematic of the kind of creative studio spaces, art and design that happen in this building. But it is an ensemble of old and new buildings and old and new parts of buildings. And then the secondary school, which came after that. So the first one was designed and built between sort of 2013 and 2015. And this was designed and built between 2015 and 2020. So it finished last summer. And it's on the site of an old fire station and on the corner of a major road. And as you can see, sort of effectively two other roads wrapping around it. This is the old fire station, which was on the site when we started. But this is the building that had preceded that fire station. So it was a quite different scale of building on that site. And as I said, I'm going to just take you through a process really by which the earliest sketches and models start to develop the idea of the building. So here, all you can see from this is the idea that perhaps the apartment building is to the right and the school is to the left. And gradually we start to map out a kind of courtyard building with a hall to the south and classrooms perhaps to the north and to the east. And the idea that that courtyard may have classrooms on various floors, served by a gallery of external circulation, with a glimpse through here from the street, and some particular roof forms, some of which survived to the end of the project. And some early sketches starting to kind of grapple with the scale of the apartment building that was required. Part of the reason the apartment building was required, probably the only reason the apartment building was required, was to subsidise the building of this primary school on a site which open to the open market. The value of the site was derived from the number of apartments that you'd otherwise build on it. But of course, we ended up with a much more challenging situation, because the presumption was that a certain scale of building would go here and the apartments would spread across the whole site. But what we then had to develop an argument with the planners and with everybody, which is we needed to consolidate the housing, and we could consolidate the housing at the east end adjacent to the busy road and free up the west and south elevations onto the quieter street for the school. As these sketches start to suggest a building around a courtyard, a taller building and a smaller building, and questions of civicness, perhaps the trope of the arch, which didn't survive but is there as a kind of expression of the civicness of the building, but also starting to explore the question of how we deal with this angle of the street of Enfield Road coming in from the northwest. And that then becomes absolutely critical, because there were issues with sunlight and daylight, which led us to develop a very particular plan. We also started thinking about the idea of arcades and how you might create a lot more outside space at the base of the building. And part of the reason why that became really crucial is that, as this sketch doesn't actually yet show, but what ends up happening is that the mass of the building has to push into the southeast corner to get away from a building here and the impact it will have on it. As a result, and that volume is valuable above the ground floor for apartments, but actually we could then eat quite significantly back into the ground floor to create a generous and recognizable kind of civic gesture. So more sketches. So I hope you don't think this is indulgent in any way, but it's really just to illustrate a process by which this thing comes to life, be it through hand-drawn diagrammatic plans, sketches, notebook sketches, sketchbook, from a sketchbook, and very simple foam models, which get gradually, not to say sophisticated at this stage, but certainly more explicit in what they're trying to demonstrate, both in terms of the relationship between a big solid of a building and an open courtyard, the idea being to push, as it were, the school to its perimeters to carve out the biggest possible space. And then we start exploring this kind of question of how you relate to this diagonal geometry, and in this case, start to rotate the top, and then start to shave off this corner in the northeast corner because of the impact of light on this building behind here. And this then starts to create a building of, it's almost a cluster of smaller buildings forming a more massive building. And you can see at this point, still the top is sort of rotating away from the rest of the building. And we're looking down a road, Kingsland Road, to west to the left, north up to the right. And this is the diagonal street, Enfield Road, here, as we come down to the Kingsland Road. So we're in the north side of the building as it rises above the corner building of which it's having the most impact on. And these sketches starting to explore the idea that the facade, which will turn out to be a brick facade, could be really quite malleable, almost like a piece of clay, as a sculptor might sculpt a block of clay. And the model here starting to show again more of that kind of sculpting of the mass, and now something approximating the form that it took when it was built, both in terms of the geometry of the point block, but also the roof forms of the school. And so this is a drawing which we made to illustrate, in a way, to the planners the logic by which what ultimately is a building with a fairly huge floor plan starts to take on a form that breaks it down, but also relates it to the school. And this is a progression of geometrical form. So we end up here with a building which has a kind of pronounced, expressed cubic form to the southeast, a recessive cubic form to the northwest, and then these angled facades that relate to things around it. And again, a progression of models from the most basic. And here we're really just dealing with mass, and then we start to be dealing with fenestration and balconies and so on. And so this is getting close to the final form. Here you can see the primary school in the foreground, the secondary school in the background, and that exploration, as it were, of form in clay. And here's the ground floor plan. And this is the main road here, north-south. This is the subsidiary road, east-west. And the apartment building is essentially sheltering the school from the noise and the fumes of the main road. And this angle generated by the daylight that we needed to get to this building. And it might have been easy, I suppose, just to make an orthogonal building and slice the corner off. But what started to become evident to us was that this sort of diagonal axis, where we could not only express this corner and recess this corner, but we could take this geometry and repeat it and mark both the relationship to Enfield Road and the need for daylight, but also to pick up a crescent of listed houses on the other side of the road to the east, and to kind of, I suppose, draw the building's attention to the central London, which is, broadly speaking, to the west, but slightly to the south. But this also then opens up a diagonal to get sunlight early as possible into that courtyard, and also a diagonal relationship to the entrance to the secondary school on the south side of Downham Road. Then the logic is that the bulk of the classrooms are on the north range of the courtyard facing south, with sunlight, but also as far away from the fumes and the noise of the road over here, from the road here, and the hall, in a way, the most public part of the school, forming the front of the school and a buffer for the rest of the school. And here, as built, we're looking at the school building here. The school extends in under the tower, both at ground and first floor. One thing I suppose it's worth pointing out is that this is a school with basically no corridors. So all of the circulation is within the courtyard and within the galleries wrapping around the courtyard. And the only corridor is here is about 10 metres long, and it's all for sort of staff spaces and storage and a few meeting rooms and stuff. So a child coming to school here, age 4 or 5, will not use a corridor, at least here, until they go to secondary school, aged 11 or 12, which seems, I mean, has very interesting connotations in terms of kind of the experience, which becomes self-evident in the photographs, and the social potential and the environmental potential, but also leads to a really efficient building, because the space that would be wasted in the corridors is actually then invested back in teaching spaces. So we end up with a bigger school, and we end up with larger amounts of outside space, because the outside space would otherwise have been taken up by the circulation. And what might have otherwise been a school organised around a central double-loaded corridor in which, you know, there are issues, I guess, of kind of managing behaviour. Quite the opposite happens here. Every child has a sense of how they relate to the kind of cosmological kind of structure of the school. And, you know, a sibling can explain to a younger sibling kind of, they can literally stand in the middle of the courtyard and explain the whole school. It's all visible. And so the various elements of the building which we explored, and we started to look at the entrance here, which my cursor keeps sort of disappearing, reappearing. But we ended up producing a working with an artist on the gate, which I'll show in a minute. And this is the space, the point of entrance, where with the hall on the left and the apartment building on the right, and that diagonal sort of wedge of space illuminated. It has a gallery at first floor, and then this kind of residual apse marking the end of the hall, as if in some way it's reminiscent of a church and the kind of civic connotations of that, which you can see here. And in the model, these sort of studies start to explore the way in which we can introduce a staircase into that semicircular space and how we might cover it, which is a practical requirement. But actually that then turns into something very powerful here under construction and here completed. And so this is as you come into the school with the stair and that open space and the hall on your left, and you can start to see, and this is the artist's a chap called Paul Morrison, who is based in Sheffield, and he made a drawing which we then translated into a pattern in a gate, which is a spider's web and a dandelion, and it marks the threshold, I suppose, between the adult world and the child's world. And here you can see the end of the hall at the first floor and a glimpse through to the school and a glimpse back the other way. And so this red brick architecture gives way to a glazed brick interior to the courtyard here with the apartment in the background. And here you can see the kind of the moulding of the masonry of the facades as the screen on the right is turning to the southwest. And the first floor with the classrooms and the void over the hall and 4 more classrooms here and 4 apartments here. And you can see here in the section, you start to see, or rather in the axonometric, the spaces of the classrooms on the lower floors and the classrooms on the upper floors. And the larger classrooms sit on the lower floors and they share the same facade line. But because they're larger than the ones above, we can get north light in the back. And it enabled us to shelter from the sun the galleries, but also the classrooms. And here you can see the hall on the left. And so, in a sense, I guess an idea that the school can be as removed from the world as possible. And you can see the classrooms on the right. And this architecture, I suppose, coming back to this idea of the making of wall, this wall is 0.88 of a meter thick, not solid masonry, but built up out of brickwork and in a way a lot of air, and it sits behind this canopy. And as this section shows, as it were, you notice the canopy comes down over the large window and in a way invites the outside of the gallery to be part of the classroom, as the roof volume or roof surface wraps over the wall and down and frames the space. And you'll notice here a window seat. And so I guess the sort of social potential of the building is being imprinted in the fabric of the wall. And here you're seeing the inside of the classrooms under construction. And here the classrooms, this is 2 classrooms on top of each other, where there's this an array of openings which invite things like, here's a door, but next to the door is a shutter which allows, as it were, parents to talk to teachers before kids run out at the end of the day, especially if they're the little ones, but also sort of manage ventilation. And here on this side, on the inside of the classroom, a kind of reading corner where the glass comes to the face of the building. And here the opposite happens, where the glass recedes deep into the wall and forms then a bench. So each classroom has this bench. And for the littlest kids, they kind of treat this almost like a shop front and drag their stuff out and set up a stall. And in a way, define their own space outside their classroom, much like one might a shop front or a market stall. And then here you can see that imprinted on the inside with the door or the shutter, the deep window revealed to this side, of course, from the inside, this being the flush, the opposite of what it is on the outside. And you'll notice that the canopy here is actually, in a way, extremely is limiting. It's intentional that this window is inviting you to see the underside of that canopy and to recognize that canopy to be part of the space of the classroom, whilst at the same time lighting this classroom above with north light, with a degree, of course, sunlight, but actually orientated to work well in that context. And then you get unusual spaces like this. So all the circulation is external, and this staircase takes you not only to the first floor, but the second floor up to some classrooms here, whilst the apartment building carries on here. And this is the underside of a privy, an outdoor loo, effectively, that's built on top of that space, if my cursor reappears here. So this is the lift shaft and the lift overrun, and a toilet up here, and it bears on this volume above this classroom at the top of the building, which is like this. And you get a sense then of how the kids can move around the building at ground floor, first floor, up to the second floor, up again onto the third floor roof and onto so the building is working to extract as much external space in this kind of inner city setting as possible, not only the area of the courtyard, but the area of the gallery extending over the courtyard, and then the roof garden here. And this is the head of the stair that arrives on the roof. And here you're on the roof. So just to start to talk about the outside of the building, the apartment building. So this is the sort of ensemble of the sort of civic element of the school and the apartment building. Of course, in a way, the school is borrowing from the scale and presence of the apartment building. And I mentioned about the residual apse here forming part of the plan, as it were, of the hall. And this is the hall lit by clear story windows. And so you end up with a conundrum about what to do with the ground floor. And what we've done here is to treat it like an unfurled chapter house. Bear in mind, this is a south elevation. So we set up this rhythm of brick piers, and at the base of the wall, a concrete bench. And here is the hall interior and the frame of concrete used to build it, and as complete. So you're still the structure is present in the space, and you'll notice that it's lit on three sides, and that being the south side. And this is the north side, opening to the school courtyard, and this is the south side. And so here we are. This is the hall, and these are the classrooms above, and here is the unfurled chapter house bench. So this is on the quiet street facing south, and you can see again, like I was saying about the benches inside the school, that one's kind of imprinting social possibilities in the facade of the building. And one of the things which I suppose the school can do extremely well is it provides, as is often the case for families with primary school age kids, the kids make friends through the parents make friends through the kids, but that's only possible if the parents meet each other. And so this was an ambition right from the start. Once we'd established the idea of the kind of unfurled chapter house and the bench, with the possibility that it invites people at the end, particularly perhaps at the end of the day when they're waiting for their kids to come out to sit and chat. Of course, people will do their own thing, but this is not a contrived photograph in any way. This is exactly how it is. So the rest of the building is an apartment building with 8 flats, a floor, around an octagonal stair. And I've talked somewhat about the geometry. That sort of sequence of squares and those diagonals and this perforate arcades to northeast and west-southwest, and this dominant corner on the corner. That's the octagonal core up the middle with its staircase, 11 stories plus a basement, so there's a 12-story spiral staircase at the heart of the plan. And when we were starting to make the compose the facades, we were exploring the idea, I suppose, of pairing floors. And this collage was a crucial moment, I suppose, in realizing how we might make the architecture, which was, in a way, this is literally a collage of the Villa Rotunda stacked 5 times, and starts to offer a clue about how to make walls and how to make spaces. And in the context of some of the things I've been saying earlier about how to make terraces and balconies and this sort of translates into this facade here. And so that is that sort of dominant corner on the southeast side, which that part of the facade is then repeated in the north opposite corner. And then here it is as built. Let's just give you some idea of how it's constructed. So we have a precast set of columns and vaults at the base of the building, which is integral. And then we constructed the in situ frame off that precast. So this is complicating the process somewhat, but the precast is absolutely integral to the structure. And then we use a mixture of brick and precast string courses and columns and piers to form a kind of frame. So again, we've designed out all the sort of steel work that one would normally use to build a brick wall at a high level. And we're actually using shock connectors. So these are brick-faced or concrete, either brick-faced concrete or concrete beams, effectively bolted through insulated connectors back to the slab on the inside. And then it's possible just to build the hand-laid brickwork walls off that. The alternative being panelized brick-faced concrete, which has a far higher carbon content. And you can start to see the building. It's quite advanced construction. You can see inside the in situ kind of core, anatomy, frame, and the elements as they're fixed to, and then walls built up. And so, there's this kind of curious amount of depth within the facade, where each flat has a significant amount of threshold liminal space between inside and out. If my cursor is that space, is this space. And but then there are other spaces running around the perimeter. There is this, in a sense, there's this sort of brick and concrete exoskeleton that's meandering around the inner thermal lined sort of fabric of the building, or space plan of the building, generating these spaces around the perimeter, spaces like this and like this. And then the building meets the sky with a kind of crown, and you get conditions like this and this. And then just coming back down to the ground, these are the last few slides, but just to give you a sense of I think the last few slides talk about how we constructed some of the precast, but also how that kind of heavy masonry structure meets the ground. Actually, one thing is we developed this element, the pie, which you can see it here. It's 2 columns and a beam. It's the sill height of a window at 800, and it's a sufficiently massive element that it disguises, as you can see here, the railing that sits behind it, and deals with the kind of anomaly between the conventional sill height of a window and the height of a balustrade. And here, the development of the arcade through models, where we explore the idea of sort of dropping the barrel vaults behind the columns, which is partly to try and extend the height of the columns to get the maximum height, of that ground floor. Even though there was limitations on the height we could achieve floor to floor, we could exaggerate the dimensions of the columns. And you'll notice these barrel vaults, which are here made from this mould, here struck from the mould. And then this is how we built the base of the building, piecing together the pieces of precast, and then essentially use those precast elements, including those barrel vaults, to form the mould into which to pour in situ concrete and off of which to construct the rest of the building. So there's not really much more to say, but just to show you a handful of slides about the sort of detail of the building and the sort of precision with which the concrete was cast and finished using sandblasting or acid etching and the bricks. And so this is one thing I suppose I should say is that this is not pigmented concrete, unlike Chadwick, the student housing at Roehampton, which was pigmented concrete, which is interesting for the colour variation that generated. This colour is generated by the sand and the aggregate, the red sand and aggregate that was actually used to make the concrete. And that kind of malleability that was evident in the plan of the building and in the facades becomes apparent right down the ground in the shaping of the arcades and the relationship between these dropped soffits and the columns. And again, the malleability, sort of counterintuitive way in which the brick becomes this soft form. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Simon. That was brilliant. So we'll open up for some questions now. If you guys want to type them into the chat function or the Q&A, if you just put next to it as well, if you'd like to ask yourself, and we can open up for a bit of a conversation. But to get us started, we had one coming from Elena while you were speaking. So Elena was asking, how compatible is timber construction with brick cladding as opposed to concrete or steel?
It's perfectly compatible at a sort of reduced height. I mean, the problem with timber is post Grenfell, as in the dreadful fire in Kensington in West London, was it 3 or 4 years ago? That's resulted in a kind of total loss of confidence in timber construction, particularly in any kind of residential building, or basically where they say there's what's called sleep risk. So anybody who's going to sleep in a building, it almost discounts timber construction. I mean, it doesn't discount it for a sort of small scale building, a couple of stories, but it does discount it for high-rise, medium to high-rise buildings. Not the case in Paris. A friend of mine is working on the Olympic Village for the next Paris Olympics, and they're building, I don't know, something like 10,000 homes. They're building all of that in medium to high-rise buildings using a timber structure. Whether it's got brick on the front, but I mean, I guess this kind of the thing that we've been exploiting is either the use of load-bearing masonry next to perhaps more conventional forms of construction, and so therefore the building's appearance is explicitly is literally constructed because it is supporting its own weight, or where we're using sort of the technologies of insulated structural connections between the external element of facade and the inner structure, and then using that as the sort of foundation or beam or bearing off which to build brickwork. So, not so easy to do with CLT with timber. Once you're at any sort of height, the timber's not going to take the weight of the brickwork. Well, it will, CLT will, but you'll end up using shelf angles of steelwork to support the brickwork off the CLT. I mean, we are finding this kind of question of embodied energy really fascinating because, once you're building above a couple of stories and people resist laying hand-laid brick, a brick facade becomes a concrete brick-faced concrete panel, and the carbon in a brick-faced concrete panel is greater, it's self-evidently greater than a concrete panel. So people are dismissive of a concrete facade, not realizing that the likelihood is that the brick facade is actually a concrete facade with a brick face on it, which is roughly 1.5 times the carbon.
I'm sure that's answered the question. Thank you. We've had another one come in from Brendan. I think Brendan's going to ask himself. If you want to unmute.
Hi, Brendan. You're mute.
Unmute himself.
Hi.
Hi.
Hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi. I was just going to ask. Sort of looking at your presentation, it was absolutely great. But see, with the emphasis on like raw material and express structure, sort of geometric shapes, they're quite like minimal ornamentation. Is this a kind of like a new version of brutalism? I was gonna suggest brictalism, and I thought I'd give that a wee Google just to see. And I believe you've got a chapter in a book named.
You found me out. Yeah. Is it brutalism? It's a good question. Have you read the book?
No, I've actually just requested it.
Read the book. At least, my philosophy is that brutalism isn't a style. My view is that it's a kind of mindset. It's a tradition. You could project it backwards, pre the Smithsons and pre Rayner Banham, and you can clearly project it forwards. And perhaps one of the most obvious contemporary proponents, and sort of almost, admittedly, Grafton architects are clearly using sort of primary structural materials of concrete and brick, and really sort of demonstrable structures, quite extraordinary, daring structures, to make socially sort of explicit buildings, if that makes sense. So I think that's the motivation is really that kind of, in terms of the UK and Europe, I think the welfare state, particularly in the UK, but the kind of what happened post-war in the third quarter of the 20th century was really a kind of democratizing of society and the welfare state and the architecture in a way that supported that ambition. It seems quite appropriate that they had a sort of simplicity about its material, or direct nature of the materials, channeled into social ideas, not just of equality, because that could just be a kind of mathematical abstract idea, but you can see it in the sort of typologies of the buildings and in the relationships between the spaces within the buildings, that the kind of social property of these buildings is primary in their mind. So yes, I think it is a form of brutalism, and I don't think it's a bad word, because I don't think it's not concrete.
Well, I've just finished my essay about the Barbican and sort of looking past the brutalism, and then just looking at some of your work, the sort of school with the tower of like residential, some of the facades. It seemed like there's a sort of strong influence. It's almost like it's kind of hidden. It's like the principles, but then it's like with a more like socially acceptable, or like like people enjoy brick more than they enjoy a big brutal like concrete wall. So it just seems like it's almost like a facelift of it, but like the kind of core principles still the same.
Well, Brendan, the next few buildings we're going to build are going to be concrete.
Really?
Because building at any height, at least in the UK, it's no longer possible. I mean, you could build in a steel frame, but you can't build in a steel frame residential buildings, or at least generally. There's a whole series of reasons which I won't go into, but you may well recognise why it doesn't really work. So you end up, because of the constraints on CLT, because of current government policy, which is not scientifically based, it's just become. It's just a decision. It's a diktat. Anyway, the result is you end up with concrete frames, and now what we're discovering is the way buildings are procured, and we have so little control over if a brick wall was to be hand laid or not. The carbon in a brick face panel is so much more that actually it leads us to make the ethical decision of cladding our buildings in concrete. Now, it's early days, but it seems to be the way that we are being sort of driven. But probably with a fair degree of Pleasure.
Thank you very much. So are you a fan of the Barbican or not?
Oh yes, yeah.
Big fan.
Yeah. But I do think you should look much further afield, because sort of English brutalism is one thing, and yeah, it depends. Lots of people have sort of denied they were brutalists, but you should look at the Paulista movement in Sao Paulo, which again distinguished themselves because they said this is our movement. It's not your movement. It's not Eurocentric. But people have different motivations. Again, in the book, I talk about I suppose, what were then colonies coming out of colonial power and establishing their independence, and using partly, again, for that kind of ambition, but also as a response to the economies of building, the climate. There's a whole series of reasons why this type of building seemed relevant there as well. So yeah, it's got sort of a whole series of different kind of motivations.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Perfect, thank you. So we'll move on to a question we've had in from Helen. So Helen's asked, Helen said, really interesting lecture. You mentioned working with artists for Hackney, with an artist for Hackney Schoolgate entrance. Do you enjoy working with artists and other designers for projects, and is it something you've practiced as often?
It's something it's quite difficult for us to do, if you mean, as in getting our kind of clients to agree to it. And we've succeeded on a project called the Ackerman Health Centre. We worked with two artists, which one was a chap called Daniel Sturgis, who's a painter, and he made a series of designs for what turned out to be ventilation screens for a car park. Paul Morrison, who was the architect we collaborated with here, made a mural inside the art centre. And again, we also worked with Paul for the Poppy Factory, which is a charity based in Richmond, but actually that, for various financial reasons, is not going to see light of day. And we've worked with a couple of other artists and graphic designers, but it's a rare treat to be able to do it, but it's a great thing when it happens.
She also went on to say, so she's curious also how you explore ergonomics and design spaces for children, as a sense of scale and play is different, and asked the name of the American scholar who focuses on social infrastructure.
Yeah, so I'll do it in reverse order. The scholar is a chap called Eric Klinenberg, Klinenberg, and the book that I have read, and I'm not sure whether there are others, it's called Palaces for the People, and he's New York based, and it's sort of, well, I don't know about whether you'd call it soft research, but it's observational research about social scenarios, and he's really talking about the role of public buildings in public life, particularly schools, housing, libraries, parks, those kind of things. What was the rest of the question? Children, ergonomics.
Yeah.
But I guess part of it is physical, and also the other part of it is emotional. It's kind of putting yourself in that. I mean, we're not experts, and it's not like we spent lots of time working with child psychologists and things like that. But it seems intuitive to us that you just that introduction of the bench outside each classroom. So the world of difference. If those children had a classroom off a busy corridor, artificially lit, probably quite noisy, and just straight and boring with no views, and a door in a plasterboard wall into the classroom, they have no intuitive relationship with the world. But by placing the classroom with its literally a kind of shop front, it's got this whole array of windows. It's obviously quite playful. And then it has direct connection to the gallery or the courtyard below, or to the courtyard if it's on the lower floor. So these children completely understand that the 25 of them are, there's 25 next door. In fact, they share a door. Each year has two classrooms that interconnect, but they know they can literally look around that space and they understand their relationship to the world. So these 4 or 5-year-olds kind of start to make sense of this unimaginable thing. As very small children do, they think the world revolves around them, and eventually we realize it doesn't. So this is all part of that. and things like the bench is a physical manifestation of that, because it's literally a kind of first step outside of the classroom, and it's sort of their territory in the next scale of. So the Smithsons talked about the idea of association, and all sorts of other people have written and talked about these ideas, and we've been exploring for what is now 25 years, these kind of increments of sort of social interaction, or as the Smithsons say, association. And I would strongly recommend, if you've not looked at the work of Team 10, which is a whole series of architects from the sort of third, they took over Siam and established Team 10 in 1950 something, and it's people like Giancarlo De Carlo, Aldo van Eyck, Bill Howell, the Smithsons, and others, Dutch, Italian, English, and they thought so hard, I suppose, about not only reintroducing history into discussions and urbanism, but also sort of social ideas. And so you take something like Aldo van Eyck's orphanage building, which is worth studying for, I think, exactly the kind of questions you're asking.
So going on with the sort of primary school, how do you feel? What are the benefits of this sort of residential and school hybrid, and how do the sort of resident staff pupils find that hybrid?
Well, I guess it's probably too early to tell how successful it is in terms of the duality of the two uses. And there was much debate about the proximity of the two and fears of the children being sort of vulnerable to, in terms of safeguarding and overlooking from the apartment. So we made the apartments a certain way so that basically there's only bedrooms overlooking the school, and all the living spaces and all the balconies face away from the school. So that's good. The school definitely works. The headmistress is really very clear about how well it works, how easy it is, and how joyful it is, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, the relationship between the two, I mean, to a certain extent, all we're really doing is bringing two typologies that might be next door to each other, sort of, so they touch. Nothing to say that somebody couldn't build, and people do build an apartment building next to a school. Here, we just have to build them together.
Yeah, true. So I've had another question coming from Erin, who has asked, how do you decide what type of brick you use in each project?
That's an impossible question. It's just one of the joys of working with brick, is to explore the colour, the way it's made, but also the way it's pointed. So a huge difference in brickwork is whether the mortar is the same colour or a contrasting colour to the brick, and whether the mortar is flush or deeply recessed. And one of the things that we tend to explore is the similarity of colours, so that the textures are the things that you read differently. So, for example, well, in fact, I think all the projects we showed you, there's very little contrast between the brick, the mortar, and the precast used in each building. In some cases, there's very little difference in the colour at all, but there's a huge difference in the texture. So the texture of mortar, the texture of brickwork, the texture of the brickwork, or the texture of the brick, and then the texture of the brickwork because of the mortar, its relationship to the brick. In the case of Frampton and Littleton, we laid the brickwork what's called wild bond. So it's not stretcher bond. It's a completely loose array of bricks. All the perpends don't line up. So that sort of breaks down the kind of patterning of the brickwork and turns it into something that's even more monolithic, which probably, well, I certainly didn't talk about when we look at the photographs, but probably need the right kind of photograph to spot it. But yes, our inclination is to work in the fine margins of sort of textural difference and the shadow and light that kind of creates, rather than the colour.
So to continue on that sort of theme, Lucy has asked, have you ever dealt with perforated brick facades?
Have we ever dealt with perforated brick facades? We've used some perforated brick. What you mean, as in sort of loosely bonded with gaps in it?
Yeah,
what you mean.
I assume so.
So we did that for a house, which I could have shown you today, which is an even more brutal building, where the planners were adamant that there was issues of overlooking. So we basically put brick screens in front of the bedroom windows. So yes, but not a lot.
Yeah. And I'll just ask if anyone's got any final sort of questions before we finish up tonight. This is the sort of last call. But another one we've had in is how sustainable is building with brick in comparison to that of mass timber, for example?
Well, I suppose the question is, it's back to my sort of early kind of comments about, are we building in brick? I mean, Chadwick is definitely a building in brick. It's a building inside, it's a building outside a building, or it's a building inside a building. There's a brick ruin wrapped around a more conventional concrete frame, and those brick walls are load bearing. Remind me So the question is, are we building with them, and can you build in mass timber? So, as I said earlier, the British government is now really resistant to building medium to high rise CLT buildings, particularly anywhere where people will sleep. So that's out of the question. Timber cladding. That's really what we're talking about, comparing timber cladding with timber with brick facades. Yeah. I guess, low rise, you can clearly build a timber framed house and clad it in timber. And that is unquestionably the most sustainable way to build a house. And there's no reason it won't last a very long time. Part of the reason, I guess, why people, the appeal of brickwork is its robustness. But as long as you build it properly, as in use it properly rather than use it as a skin, as in almost like a kind of tile. And of course, its design life depends on the things you've used to hold it up. So it really depends on whether you're building. Depends whether you're building in the UK or not. I don't know what the rules are in Scotland, but I imagine they're probably still the same. So what we can do here is different from what you can do in mainland Europe in terms of high-rise buildings. Low-rise buildings, you've got far more freedom. And again, it depends whether you're talking about the structure or the facades, which may or may not be structural.
So I think that's probably a good place to finish up tonight.